Felix Sherman took a slow sip of his black coffee, his eyes fixed on the cafe floor as he listened to the chatter around him. He had built his fortune by turning around struggling businesses, and 10 years ago, he had bought this cafe chain, determined to make it thrive. But lately, something felt off. Complaints had trickled in rude employees, inconsistent service, even accusations of discrimination. His district manager had assured him everything was under control. But Felix didn't trust second-hand reports. He needed to see the truth for himself. Disguised in a worn hoodie, jeans, and a pair of glasses, he blended in easily. The cafe had 10 locations, and this one was in a busy part of the city. None of the staff had ever met him in person. He handled most business from headquarters, relying on district managers and reports to keep things running. He regretted that now. The cafe was moderately busy, customers chatting over lattes and bagels. Felix sat near the counter, observing the employees. A young woman with auburn hair worked the register, her movements quick and efficient. A tall, lanky waiter in his 20s leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. Then the door opened, and a man walked in. He was older, his clothes worn and layered, his face weathered. A homeless man. He hesitated near the entrance, eyes scanning the menu. Felix watched closely as he approached the counter. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice rough. "Could I get a coffee?" The auburn-haired cashier, who had been friendly with other customers, glanced at the waiter. The waiter barely looked up from his phone. "We don't serve people like you," the waiter said flatly. Felix felt a slow burn in his chest. The homeless man swallowed. "I have money," he said, pulling out a few crumpled bills. "Just a coffee." The waiter finally looked at him, sneering. "I don't care if you've got money. You can't sit here. We have an image to keep. Find somewhere else." Felix clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay silent. He needed to see how far this would go. The man hesitated, glancing around as if hoping someone would intervene. The cashier looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. The other customers pretended not to notice. Felix had seen enough. He stood up, walking toward the counter. Before he could speak, a different employee, an older woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, stepped in. She wore an apron, likely a shift supervisor. "That's not how we treat people," she said firmly, glaring at the waiter. The waiter scoffed. "Come on, Lisa, you know how this looks." Lisa folded her arms. "I know that everyone deserves respect." She looked at the homeless man. "Sir, what would you like?" The man hesitated, as if unsure if this was real. "Just a small coffee." Lisa nodded and rang it up herself. "It's on the house today." The man's eyes softened. "Thank you." Felix watched the waiter shake his head, muttering under his breath. He turned and walked toward the back, clearly irritated. Felix exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had seen the worst and the best of his employees in just a few minutes, but this wasn't over. He sat back down, sipping his coffee, already planning his next move. Felix stayed in his seat, his coffee growing cold as he watched the cafe settle back into routine. The homeless man took his small coffee with quiet gratitude, finding a corner table where he sat hunched over the cup, as if expecting to be told to leave at any moment. Lisa, the shift supervisor, went back to her duties, her expression tight with frustration. Felix's eyes shifted toward the kitchen entrance, where the waiter had disappeared. He needed to see more. Rising from his seat, he made his way toward the counter. Lisa was adjusting a stack of paper cups when she noticed him. "Need something?" she asked, her voice polite but distracted. "I was wondering if you guys were hiring," Felix said. "I'm looking for work, any position." Lisa gave him a quick once-over, her brow furrowing. "You have any experience in food service?" "A little," Felix lied. "I can learn fast." She hesitated, then sighed. "We're short-staffed. The manager isn't in today, but if you can come back tomorrow morning, he'll be here for interviews. Felix nodded. I'll be here. As he turned to leave, Lisa called after him. What's your name? Phil, Felix said, giving a variation of his middle name. Lisa nodded, then returned to her work. Felix walked out of the cafe, his mind already racing with his next steps. If he wanted to see how deep the problems ran, he needed to be on the inside. The next morning, Felix arrived dressed in simple jeans and a plain black t-shirt. The manager, a man in his late 40s with a thinning hairline and a permanent look of exhaustion, met him in the back office. You worked in cafes before, the manager asked. Briefly, Felix said, I'm good with people, I work hard. The manager barely looked up from his desk. We need someone who can take orders, clean tables, and handle rush hours without slowing down. Pays minimum wage. You want the job. Felix nodded. Good, you start now. Within minutes, Felix was handed an apron and thrown into the rush. The cafe was already filling up, and he quickly found himself stationed behind the counter, taking orders alongside the young woman he had seen the day before. Stick close, I'll show you how things work, she said, punching in an order. I'm Amy, by the way. Felix nodded, following her movements carefully. He noted how fast she worked, barely pausing between customers. Every now and then, her eyes flickered toward the lanky waiter from the previous day, who was leaning against the counter again, half-heartedly tossing a dish towel between his hands. Felix saw an opportunity. That guy always this helpful, he asked quietly. Amy pressed her lips together. Don't get me started. Felix kept pressing. Lisa seems solid, your manager. Amy hesitated, then lowered her voice. He doesn't care. He's barely here, and when he is, he just wants everything running with no complaints. If you're looking for backup, don't expect it. Felix absorbed this. He had expected mismanagement, but the level of neglect was worse than he thought. He kept working, observing everything. Lunch rush hit hard. Orders piled up, and Felix saw how the cracks widened. Amy was fast, but overwhelmed. Lisa helped where she could, but she was constantly pulled away to handle issues. Meanwhile, the waiter whose name Felix finally caught as Greg continued to do the bare minimum, rolling his eyes whenever asked to pitch in. Then, the homeless man from the previous day returned. He hesitated near the entrance again, lingering as though debating whether to step inside. Felix watched as Greg spotted him, his expression twisting with annoyance. Felix tensed, waiting. Greg strode toward the counter, speaking loudly enough for customers to hear. Thought I made it clear we don't need people like you hanging around. The cafe grew quieter. Amy froze mid-order. Before Felix could step in, Lisa emerged from the back. Greg, that's enough. Greg scoffed. He's making people uncomfortable. Lisa's voice hardened. The only person making things uncomfortable is you. She turned to the man at the door. Sir, you're welcome here. Would you like to order something? The man looked between them, uncertain. Greg let out a sharp laugh. This is why this place is a joke. You let people like him sit around and scare off real customers. Felix had seen enough. He pulled off his apron, stepping forward. Greg, he said, his voice calm but firm, you should stop talking. Greg turned, his usual smirk faltering. Who are you supposed to be? Felix met his gaze evenly. Own this cafe. A silence. Amy's eyes widened. Lisa's mouth parted slightly in shock. Greg's face drained of color. Felix kept his voice level. I've spent the last 2 days watching you treat customers like garbage while your coworkers pick up your slack. I've seen how you talk to people you think don't matter, and I've seen enough. Greg opened his mouth, then shut it. He turned toward the manager's office, as if expecting backup, but the manager had stepped out, his face a mask of discomfort. Felix didn't wait for excuses. "You're fired, effective immediately." Greg's mouth twisted. "You can't." "I can," Felix interrupted. "And I just did. Get your things and leave." Greg looked around, as if expecting someone to argue. No one did. Lisa crossed her arms. Amy watched in stunned silence. Felix turned to the homeless man, his tone softer. "I'm sorry for how you've been treated here." The man nodded slowly. "I just wanted a coffee." "You'll always be welcome here," Felix said. Then he turned to Lisa. "Let's talk in the back. We've got some things to fix." Lisa nodded, her expression unreadable. As Greg stormed out, Felix knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Felix followed Lisa into the back office, closing the door behind them. The space was cramped, cluttered with stacks of paperwork and a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed faintly overhead. The manager stood awkwardly near the desk, arms crossed over his chest, avoiding eye contact. Lisa exhaled sharply, leaning against the desk. "I had no idea who you were," she admitted. Felix nodded. That was the point. The manager finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Look, if I had known you were coming." Felix raised a hand, cutting him off. "That's exactly the problem. Things should run properly whether I'm here or not." He turned to Lisa. "You stepped in when it mattered. I want to know what's really happening here, what's been ignored, what needs fixing." Lisa hesitated, then glanced at the manager before speaking. "People like Greg, they don't last unless someone allows it. He wasn't the first." Felix's jaw tightened. "How many have there been?" Lisa gave a tired shrug. "Too many. They come in, take advantage of the job, do the bare minimum, and treat people terribly. But nothing changes because as long as the place stays open and orders go out, no one higher up cares." Felix turned to the manager. "And you?" The man's face flushed. "I don't encourage that kind of behavior." Felix's voice remained steady. "But you let it happen." The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again. Lisa spoke up. "He barely shows up. He checks in, makes sure nothing is on fire, then disappears. If there's an issue, he doesn't want to hear about it." Felix's eyes didn't leave the manager. "Is that true?" The man swallowed. "I handle things remotely. I trust the staff to do their jobs." Felix's patience thinned. Trust isn't leadership. Trust without accountability is negligence. He let the words settle before continuing. "You've been here long enough to know what Greg was like. You allowed him to represent this cafe, and he's just one example. How many good employees have left because of people like him?" Lisa's silence answered for him. Felix exhaled, rubbing his temple briefly. "This stops today." He turned to Lisa. "I want you to take over as interim manager." Her eyes widened slightly. "Me?" "You've already been doing the job," Felix said. "You care about the people here. That's what leadership is supposed to look like." The manager stiffened. "Wait, you can't just." Felix's gaze sharpened. "You're being reassigned. You'll report to corporate for retraining. Whether you have a future here depends on what you do next." The man's face twisted, but he didn't argue. Lisa's expression was unreadable. "I wasn't expecting this." Felix gave her a small nod. "Neither was I, but you're the only person here who acted like a leader when it mattered." Lisa inhaled deeply, then nodded. "All right, I'll do it." Felix straightened. "Good, we'll bring in extra staff. Pay increases are coming, and we'll implement new policies to make sure nothing like this happens again." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "And if it does?" Felix's voice was firm. "It won't, because I'm staying involved." For the first time, Lisa's expression softened. That would make a difference. Felix glanced toward the door. The cafe outside was still running, customers filtering in and out, unaware of the shift happening behind closed doors. But things were already changing. Felix stepped out of the cramped office, his mind already piecing together the next steps. Lisa followed, her movements more deliberate now, as if the weight of responsibility had already settled onto her shoulders. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm, customers ordering, baristas moving with practiced efficiency, the espresso machine humming steadily. But there was a shift in the air. Employees stole glances at Felix, some with curiosity, others with uncertainty. They had just learned that the quiet new hire was actually the owner, and changes were coming. Amy stood near the register, her fingers tapping absently against the counter. She looked up as Felix approached. "Greg's gone," she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Felix nodded. She exhaled, her posture loosening. "About time." Lisa stepped beside him. "We're making some changes, starting with how this place is run." Amy's brow lifted slightly. "Does that mean we're actually going to get backup when we ask for it?" Felix caught the sharpness in her tone, not hostility, but frustration that had built over time. "Yes," he said, "and better pay." Amy blinked. "Seriously?" Felix crossed his arms. "You bust yourself keeping this place afloat while others skate by. That ends now." Amy glanced at Lisa, then back at Felix. "I'd like to believe that." Felix met her gaze. "Give me a reason not to follow through." Amy studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Lisa shifted her weight slightly. "We're also hiring more staff. No more being short-handed during rushes." Amy's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected things to move this fast. "Guess I won't have to chug 2 energy drinks before every shift." Felix gave a small nod before turning toward the cafe floor. The homeless man still sat at his table, his coffee long finished, his hands resting lightly on the cup. He hadn't moved much, as if unsure if he was truly allowed to stay. Felix walked over, pulling out the chair across from him. The man's wary eyes lifted. "I didn't get your name," Felix said. The man hesitated, then spoke. "David." Felix rested his hands on the table. "David, what happened today should have never been an issue. You should have been able to walk in, order, and sit like anyone else." David's fingers tightened around the cup. "It's not the first time." Felix's jaw tensed. "It'll be the last time here." David studied him, as if measuring the truth in his words. Felix nodded toward the counter. "If you ever need a hot meal, come by. You won't be turned away." David's throat worked slightly, but he only gave a faint nod. Felix stood. "Take care, David." As he walked back toward Lisa, he caught employees watching. Some looked thoughtful, others uncertain. Lisa folded her arms. "You're making waves." Felix glanced around. They needed to be made. She gave a small nod. "So what now?" Felix exhaled. "Now we fix what's broken." Lisa's gaze sharpened. "And after that?" Felix's lips pressed into a firm line. "We make sure it never breaks again." Felix spent the next 2 days embedded in the cafe, staying close enough to observe, but far enough to let Lisa assert her new authority. He watched as she adjusted to the role, stepping in with a steady confidence that hadn't been visible before. Employees responded to her differently now, some with relief, others with quiet skepticism. Lisa wasted no time addressing the staffing issues. She put up hiring notices, held quick interviews between shifts, and filled vacant positions with people who were eager to work. Felix noted how she made sure to ask the right questions, not just about experience, but about attitude. Amy, now freed from the burden of picking up others' slack, had a noticeable shift in energy. She still worked fast, but she wasn't stretched to exhaustion. Felix caught her testing the new hires, throwing them into the rush to see how they handled the pressure. She didn't tolerate hesitation, but she offered guidance when needed. Felix also made adjustments from the corporate side. He pushed through pay increases, ensuring that wages reflected the effort employees put in. More importantly, he set up a direct line for staff to report issues, one that bypassed managers entirely. No more excuses, no more ignored complaints. Then on the third day, David returned. Felix noticed him before he reached the counter. He moved with the same hesitance, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting to be turned away again. Lisa was the first to address him. She stepped forward before he could say anything, her voice steady but warm. "We've got fresh coffee brewing. You want a cup?" David's posture eased slightly, though skepticism lingered in his expression. Felix watched as Amy, standing nearby, prepared a cup without being asked. She handed it over with an easy nod before returning to the register. David accepted the coffee, gave a small nod, and took his usual seat near the window. No one looked at him twice. Felix exhaled slowly. That was the change he had wanted to see. Later that afternoon, Felix sat in the back office with Lisa, reviewing the numbers. "We're already seeing an uptick in sales," she noted. "Regulars are coming in more often. Word must be spreading." Felix nodded. "It's not just about the customers. Employees stay when they feel valued. Turnover costs more than most people realize." Lisa leaned back slightly. "So what now? You disappear back to the corporate office." Felix shook his head. "No, I made that mistake before. I'm not doing it again." Lisa studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good, because if you did, this place would fall apart again." Felix didn't argue. She was right. For too long, he had relied on reports and second-hand information, assuming the system would regulate itself. But leadership required presence. It required action. He wouldn't let distance blind him again.